Welcome to the third year of the Climate Cafe. Thanks to all of you and thanks to our sponsors. We are back. My name is Deanna Udell. I'm the Director of Communications and Public Relations, and so glad you could join us. Just so you know, the folks that are on Zoom are joining us from other universities, climate resilience officers, city officials, so welcome everybody. It's my great pleasure to introduce the new dean of the Rosenstiel School, Dr. Ben Kertman, who began his tenure on August 1st of this year. Many of you already know Dr. Kertman. He participated in our very first Climate Cafe in 23 when we discussed the year's unprecedented heat, which you'll hear more about, and the extreme weather events. Dr. Kertman is a renowned atmospheric scientist. His research focuses on climate, predictability, and advancing our understanding of a changing planet. We're truly thrilled to have him guide us into the next decade. Please welcome Dean Kertman.
So thank you all for coming. As you can see, I've prepared remarks. It's only 15 pages, so not to worry. No, single-spaced 11-point font. What? Bill, behave yourself. So thank you, Deanna. I've been in this job officially 90 days. So my mantra whenever I have to speak to an audience is be kind to me. It's my first 15 days, 30 days, now it's 90 days. I don't know how much longer I can get away with that, but please be kind to me. It's really wonderful to see such a great crowd. Really great to see that we have a really large online audience for this important conversation about Florida's coral reefs. And I do really want to thank you for taking the time to participate in this. As you all know, coral reefs here and around the world have faced tremendous challenges. There was an amazing paper that just came out. I think it was last week, but I think it was Thursday. Appeared Thursday. One of the co-authors is in the room. Came out Thursday. It's co-authored by 45 scientists, coral reef experts. Many of them here at Rosenstiel and the Cooperative Institute for Marine and Atmospheric Studies. And basically, that paper concludes that two key coral reef species here in Florida, elkhorn and staghorn corals, have become functionally extinct. So I just pause for a moment to think about that. This is the path to global extinction of corals. We should all be very concerned about that. These researchers, they focused a lot on the 2023 heat wave, but there were 9, previous mass bleaching events in the region. And that's led to the near total extinction, a collapse of the corals here. There's still some corals there, but they're not reproducing. They're not rebuilding that reef. And so personally, I'm quite concerned, as I'm sure all of you are. Okay, so that's the bad news. But it's important to us to get beyond the facts, get beyond the bad news, and start thinking about solutions. How are we going to move forward? How are we going to save what we can save? And so tonight, or this afternoon, is about the best and the brightest scientists in the world telling us how we can save these coral reefs, developing new solutions, new technology to basically save our ecosystem. This Climate Cafe exemplifies what Rosenstiel is about for me. It's about understanding the problem in front of us, the greatest challenges that society faces, and thinking about and developing solutions to those problems. We are trying to solve society's greatest challenges. So that's what makes Rosenstiel special and a more resilient future for all of us. Before we begin, importantly, first I want to call out, she's going to get mad at me for doing this, but I'm going to call her out anyways, Deanna Udell. This Climate Cafe is Deanna Udell's brainchild, and she has done such an incredible job with this Climate Cafe. This is the third year. The first 2 years were a major hit. So she's stuck now. It's handcuffs. She cannot not do this. Now, it's important to acknowledge, yes, Deanna, this wouldn't happen with Deanna, but it also wouldn't happen with our sponsors. And so the biggest laugh in the room just now, and the guy that has no fear of making fun of me at every turn, is Mr. William Bill Galway. Bill, thank you. One thing I want to say about Bill, he has been an incredible source of guidance and advice for me for a number of years, dealing with some of the challenges that I've had to deal with, in managing the Cooperative Institute, some of the tricky situations that I get myself into. Bill always manages to advise me how to get out of those situations. So, Bill, thank you for supporting the Climate Cafe, supporting CIMAS, and supporting the Rosenstiel School. We are most grateful. I also want to give a big thank you for Self-Help Credit Union and Sam Chesser for sponsoring today's reception. Those empanadas were due to the credit union and Sam Chesser, so thank you very much, Sam, the credit union. And I might add, they were mighty good empanadas. Last and not least, of course, I'm completely biased. I was and still am, the director of the Cooperative Institute here at the Rosenstiel School. That's how we collaborate with NOAA across the street. The people on stage, the people writing those papers, they continue to collaborate with our scientists. The Cooperative Institute is a really important part of what the Rosenstiel School does, and I want to thank their participation in today's event. And I also want to let you know, despite all the challenges that are in front of us in terms of federal funding for the science that we like to do, our Cooperative Institute was renewed for another 5 years. And we just started October 1 with the new Cooperative Institute. And our year one funding, despite all that you've heard, our year one funding came in full. So we are quite pleased. Boy, I'm sure talking for a long time. See, it's dangerous to give me the microphone, Deanna. And last, but definitely not least, I really want to thank Jenny Staletovich and WLRN. Their continued partnership in this Climate Cafe series is just fantastic. Jenny brings an insight to understanding and translating science for community consumption that I think is unparalleled. I just think Jenny is such a tremendous asset to the community and to WLRN. And I'm just so grateful that she's willing to do this. If you haven't come to the Climate Cafe, by the time this is done, you'll know exactly what I mean. So Jenny, thank you very much. So Deanna, I did some of the stuff I was supposed, but not all of the stuff I was supposed to do. So with that, let me turn it over to the people that you really want to hear from. So thank you.
The warming ocean waters off the Florida coast have had a devastating impact on Florida's coral reef, the third largest barrier reef system in the world. In tonight's In Depth, Manuel Bajorquez reports scientists now believe they have found at least one way to give the coral a fighting chance.
To understand the significance of this boat ride off Miami's coast, you'd have to go back to where this journey started. Off the Caribbean coast of Honduras, and a species known as elkhorn coral that forms the skeleton of a healthy reef.
This place is called Tela Bay in Honduras. It's really warm, and it's the kinds of conditions where corals have to be really tough to survive.
But Andrew Baker of the University of Miami's Rosenstiel School of Marine Science says the same species of coral in Florida's reef has been nearly wiped out by a combination of factors, including warming waters due to climate change.
Over the last 50 years or so, we've lost more and more of these elkhorn corals, culminating in 2023 when we had this really warm summer that killed well over 95% of the remaining elkhorn corals.
95%?
More than 95%, yeah. And in order for that population to recover, it was determined that we need more diversity from outside of the Florida population.
Enter the Honduran elkhorn. First, scientists with telemarine conservationists would have to carefully pluck coral from the reef in Honduras that thrive in warmer waters. Permits would be needed for the special transport of the fragments into the United States, where scientists with the University of Miami and the Florida Aquarium in Tampa would crossbreed them with Florida's elkhorn. Now to that boat ride near Miami.
It's the first time ever in the world that an international cross of corals from different countries has been permitted for outplanting on wild reefs.
It was time to plant the babies onto Florida's reef, underneath these protective umbrella trees. Carrie O'Neill is with the Florida Aquarium.
If these corals can live through the next marine heat wave, then that is critical for our coastal protection on the coast of Florida.
Coastal protection because the reefs help break up hurricane-fueled waves that could flood South Florida's coastline.
We need to now scale this up and be outplanting hundreds of thousands of baby corals all throughout the reef. And there are ways to do that, but we've got to gear up and get going. Baker
has nicknamed the new population Flonduran and is hoping they can be a sea change in the fight to protect this reef. Manuel Bojorquez, CBS News, Miami.
All right, time to start talking, Jenny. Come on up, Jenny and Dr. Baker, Michael Studevan, and Dr. Anna Palacio. And you can grab more information by scanning the QR code, so we don't take time telling you how incredibly accomplished they are. Scan the QR code if you want more biographical information. And I'm going to pass this to Andrew, which is your first.
So I'll just start talking while you're handing out the mics.
Start talking.
And so first of all, thank you, Ben. Now I'm nervous about living up to those very high expectations. Before we get started, I also just want to acknowledge our neighbors to the south. And probably a lot of you are thinking about Jamaica and Cuba. We're going to be talking about storm resilience and hurricanes. So if you want to find out more about relief efforts, WLRN.org, there should be information there. And also, as Ben pointed out, we heard some really tough news last week with the staghorn and elkhorn. So I want to ask Andrew to dive a little bit more deeply into what that means exactly and what functionally extinct. Can our reefs endure without staghorn and elkhorn? What does this mean in terms of restoration efforts if we lose the wild population? What do we use for the breeding population?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So thanks, everybody, for coming out and showing an interest in the kinds of things that I know that we spend most of our daylight hours thinking about. We heard already Ben explain the news that we've heard over the last week or so. And some of you may have heard also news that came out just 2 or 3 weeks ago about coral reefs having passed a tipping point beyond which they're unable to recover without really dramatic interventions. And I think probably the first thing that I want to just say is that we saw this coming. Coral scientists have predicted for a long time that coral reef ecosystems are some of the worst, most threatened ecosystems on the planet from the point of view of climate change. And like a slow-moving train wreck, we've seen the declines of these two really critical, iconic species on Florida's reef, elkhorn and staghorn corals, coming at us. I think if there was a surprise, it was the speed with which the remaining populations just were wiped out. We were kind of expecting this death by 1,000 cuts, and we didn't get the 1,000th cut. We got the guillotine that came down on these populations. And so I think it's a kind of an alert to us who work in this field to realize that as much as you see the thing approaching in the rearview mirror, at some point there's an impact, and the impact can be very dramatic, and it was indeed. But part of what we're here to talk about today, as Ben said, is the solutions to that. How do we respond to that? Do we throw our hands up in the air and claim ignorance or the inability to do anything? And the answer to that is a resounding no. There's definitely things we can do. And as Ben mentioned, these reefs, these two species are functionally extinct, but they're not biologically extinct. And they're still around in other parts of the Caribbean. And in fact, in some parts of Florida, like off of Miami, they're also still here. So how do we leverage the survivorship that's around there? And how do we leverage the latest science to actually try to bring these corals back and bring them back so that they're tougher, more resilient than before. So how, in fact, do we generate or make dire corals to sort of sustain Florida's reefs in these dire environmental conditions? Many of you will be familiar with dire wolves. This is my attempt at humor. Dire wolves, if Game of Thrones fans out there, are wolves that are tougher, stronger, more robust than regular wolves. And what we need now, thanks to AI, are dire corals, corals that are bigger, tougher, and stronger, that will help Florida's reefs bounce back and survive. And the good news is that dire corals do exist. They can be found in other parts of the Caribbean, and they have genetic traits that we could leverage to try to help Florida's population survive. And so one of the things that we've begun recently, just this past summer, in fact, after a year and a half's work that you saw in the movie, I was the guy in the frogman costume. I should use that for Halloween. We published this paper a couple of months ago, also in Science, trying to spark a new policy for Florida's reefs to recognize that coral reefs in the Caribbean are part of a connected system. And the way that we've operated until now, where every management jurisdiction manages their reefs as if they're their own and unconnected from the rest of the ecosystem and the rest of the region, to try to realize that we're all in this together and that we need to try to share not just the corals that we have, but the expertise and the technology that we have for these corals to have a fighting chance. And so that's why we were able to find this reef in Tela, Honduras, which is on continental Honduras, not out in the Bay Islands, where conditions are actually incredibly warm already, about 1.5 to 2 degrees warmer than Florida, which is about the same kinds of conditions that we're expecting in Florida by century's end, and about the kind of stress that they experienced during 2023, during this incredibly warm spike. And the idea is, can we breed corals from these areas using an approach called assisted gene flow, which, as the name suggests, is assisting the natural gene flow between populations and just trying to accelerate natural processes. So this involved finding the right corals in these warm reefs, harvesting them, you saw in the movie, packing them up, dealing with all of the regulatory permits, flying that on a cargo jet, thanks to Amerijet, local Miami cargo company, for sponsoring the expedition to get these corals. There was about plane, trains, and automobiles trip from the reef to the tanks here in Miami of about 16 hours, which in itself was a kind of world record for transportation of corals. And I'm happy to say that they spawned, and as you heard in the movie, with help from the Florida Aquarium, we were able to generate crosses of Florida with Honduras to make Flonduran corals. And we're able to do other things with those corals, like provision them with heat-tolerant algal symbionts, something we've also done a lot of research on in my lab here at the Marine School, to try to increase their thermal tolerance. So the idea is that there's many different approaches we can combine to try to meet the demand, the need for what we need to do. So I'll sort of close up my initial remarks here, but also just with one last thought to say that it's not just enough to develop the science to generate corals that are more thermally tolerant or more resilient. The real challenge is, how do you scale that up? How do you do it at the scale where you can actually make a difference? And as you saw in the movie clip, this involves generating hundreds of thousands of corals that we can put out onto the reef. And so that requires new technology, new innovation, new techniques, robotics, automation, and other kinds of approaches that we're developing here at the Rosenstiel School to try to meet that demand. And I kind of think of it a little bit like, not to be too doom and gloom, but it's a sort of a Manhattan Project. Faced with the scale of the problem, we have to come up with something that's equally scaled to the size of that problem in order to be able to solve it. And so we're really aggressively trying to build out an industrial scale coral facility that incorporates all of these new approaches into a solution that will help our reefs bounce back.
So I have a couple of questions.
Yes.
So you mentioned the report about tipping points, and we're getting very close to a tipping point. I think that report said 10 years we would be at a temperature or an increase since Industrial Revolution temperatures where coral could not survive. 10 years is not very long.
That's right. So, yeah, I said before and I'll say it again, coral reefs are the most vulnerable ecosystem in the world to the point of view of climate change. So if we're going to do anything about how ecosystems respond to climate change and learn lessons from it, coral reefs are really where we have to start. People debate how long do we have before this threshold is definitively reached. Some people say we've passed the threshold already. But I want to just caution that we've passed the threshold using a number of assumptions. And those assumptions are that we keep doing things the way we've done them before. We need new restoration methods, new restoration technologies, new partnerships internationally to try to meet this challenge. So when people say there's a threshold, it's a threshold assuming certain things.
Okay.
And I question those assumptions, really.
And I had asked you in the beginning if our reef could endure without staghorn or elkhorn. And maybe people know this, but why are those two corals so important?
Yeah, thanks, Jenny. So staghorn and elkhorn corals are the two probably most iconic species on Florida's reefs, especially elkhorn corals. If anyone's ever seen them, they used to be the dominant builders of shallow reefs. And elkhorn corals in particular form these really robust, thick skeletons that are typically found at the reef crest, right at the top of the reef. And they grow into the waves, almost as if they love the wave action. And in doing that, they break waves. They are the crest over which, when you see a healthy reef and you're on the beach looking out, you'll see the waves breaking over the reef crest. That's because of things like elkhorn corals, and they are the principal wave breakers. So the reason why they're so iconic and important is partly because they're very visible that way, but we also depend on them to protect our coastlines. And they are some of the most efficient coral species out there in performing this ecosystem service, as we say. So one of the reasons why we're focusing on elkhorn corals for the Assisted Gene Flow project with Honduran corals and now also Cayman corals we're doing this with, is that we don't want to resign ourselves to a future of Florida that does not have those corals anymore. They may be, the local population from Florida may be functionally extinct, but that doesn't mean to say that we can't bring back a different population with qualities from elsewhere that can still continue to perform those functions that we need, which is not just coastal protection, it's also biodiversity. You guys all probably know that coral reefs are the rainforests of the sea, one of the world's most biodiverse ecosystems. So if we're able to bring these corals back and produce the habitat that these biodiverse ecosystems depend on, then we have all kinds of other benefits as well.
And I know the elkhorn spawn, right? Did they spawn on the reef, or I know for sure in the lab because I was there.
Yeah, so they spawned, you were there. So they spawned in the lab. That was, a joyous, happy occasion. And even if you just bring back, as we did, 13 colonies, which sounds like not a lot, you have to remember that each of those colonies can produce hundreds of thousands of babies. So if you work in coral restoration using this method of harnessing sexual reproduction, you are actually acting at the point in the life cycle where you can reap huge benefits if you can ensure the survivorship of what you generate. And so a lot of this new technology that I just talked about is how do we make sure that as many of those thousands of babies survive so that we can put them out on the reef and they can grow to maturity and start to interbreed themselves. One last thing I want to mention is sometimes the scale can seem so daunting that we have to put out so many corals, but I'm not actually suggesting that every single coral that we put out onto the reef has to be something that's been touched by human hands and deployed. The idea is that you restore enough of the population that it becomes self-sustaining, and those corals grow to maturity and 3 to 5 years later are able to sexually reproduce on their own and produce new variants, which is what we need. There's a biological truism, which is that diversity begets resilience. And that is definitely something that is absolutely true on coral reefs and something that we're really working towards ensuring we maintain so that we have the most resilient reefs we can.
And we have restored endangered species before. We have succeeded in bringing populations back. And I think that's what I was wondering, like at what point do they become functional again on their own?
That's the goal. That is exactly the goal. Because this is not a biological extinction, as was mentioned, it's an extirpation, which is a local extinction or a functional extinction where they're just very rare. There's still the ability to bring those back. And I think coral restoration is a bit like forest restoration. If you're reforesting an area that has, say, burnt down for a wildfire, and you plant the forest back from seeds, from acorns, it takes a long time for those oaks, redwoods, whatever you want to take as an analogy, to grow to maturity. And coral reefs is the same thing. I think we have to realize that restoring reefs is not a short-term thing. It's the kind of thing where we're restoring animal forests made of animals that are long-lived, that can live for centuries, and they will take decades to reach their full maturity. So we have to recognize that we're playing the long game. in ensuring that we still maintain the diversity and protections that we need.
And we have forest management. Nobody blinks an eye at managing our national forests.
Exactly. Yeah.
So this next question will be pivot into Michael, which is the coral in Honduras were more resilient to temperature. Is that just something that they, through evolution, acclimatized to the warmer waters, or they tougher for whatever reason because of the environment they were in, or both?
Yeah, so that's from a scientific research perspective, that was one of the main things driving what we were doing. It had this practical reason, which was assisted gene flow to try to breed with Florida corals, but we also fundamentally wanted to figure out why were they so thermally tolerant. So we've done a lot of work on these populations to understand that. And fundamentally, the reef in Tella is just naturally warm, just by virtue of where it is. And so the corals that have survived there over thousands of years have either been selected for, because they're just part of the natural variation in a population that can do well and survive there, or that they've been sort of selected for or acclimatized over a long period of time. The other interesting thing about Tella, though, is, and this will maybe transition, is that it's not just high temperatures that these corals are flourishing under. It's also high nutrients. Tella Bay has suffered over a century of industrial agriculture, of palm oil and coconut palms. So they are used to incredibly high levels of nutrients. The water is very, very turbid. You can only really see the hand in front of your face for a few weeks a year. And so these kinds of conditions are exactly the kinds of conditions that unfortunately we're seeing in Florida, and therefore the kinds of conditions that we want in the next generation of Florida's corals. So we are looking at multiple stressors to try to figure out what's going to be best for Florida in the future.
And so, to Michael, Michael studies coral in Port Miami, or in Government Cut near Port Miami, which I don't know if it's as turbid and nutrient-laden as Tella, but it's certainly not what I would think of as hospitable conditions for coral, and yet you found them persisting.
That's exactly right. So I don't get the luxury of getting to go to Honduras for my research. Instead, I do a lot of work in our backyard and in a place where no one really wants to go. But when you learn why, I think you'll understand why it's such an exciting place to be if you're a coral biologist. And so Miami is a really difficult place to live. I don't think I need to convince anyone in this room of that. But if you're a coral, it's even more so challenging. Specifically, the Port of Miami has been urbanized for the last 100 years. So we've seen huge shifts in how land is being managed. We've had changes to natural coastal shorelines, and we now have this urban sprawl here. Tons of freshwater input from the Miami River and the surrounding watersheds, a lot of nutrient inputs from local agriculture, as well as all of those pristine green lawns that we have. And as a result, it's a really hostile environment. So what makes the Port of Miami such this jacuzzi of terrible conditions is that it changes constantly. We have the hottest hots and the lowest lows, oftentimes in the course of one day as the tide goes in and out. These reefs are extremely turbid, and yet corals are found here. They're found on artificial substrates that we would not figure would be a good place for a coral to grow. You can find them on a seawall off of Star Island. You can find them on the rubble along MacArthur Causeway. And the remarkable thing about these corals is that they're not just hanging on by a thread, they are thriving. These are some of the healthiest corals that I have seen in Florida in the last 10 years. And it's mind-boggling as to why they are doing so well. I like to joke that they're living in literal and proverbial garbage. Oftentimes these corals are at the biggest threat of dying because of human debris that falls on them, like blankets or bicycles. But those that survive seem to be remarkably resilient. And so our group has been looking at these amazing ecosystems for the last 8 years to try to understand not only what the conditions these corals are facing, but also how those corals have adapted to living in such challenging environments. And so we found some pretty interesting things. We found that these corals have more robust physiology. They host thermally tolerant symbionts, like Andrew mentioned. They seem to be able to front load different genes that allow them to be ready to handle pathogens or to be able to eat any kind of food particles that might show up. And so now we're transitioning into trying to understand how these corals might contribute to the persistence of Florida's coral reef. And so doing that, we're going a little bit outside of just the Port of Miami, because the Port of Miami is not the only urbanized port in Southeast Florida. We have two other major ports, Port Everglades and the Port of Palm Beach in Broward and Palm Beach counties, respectively. And corals can be found inside these really inhospitable conditions. And so one of the methods that we're using to try to understand how urban corals are contributing to the persistence of reef corals is through population genetics. So by taking a little tissue scrape and sequencing that DNA, we can learn how these corals are related, whether or not they could be siblings, half-siblings, yada, yada, a family tree, so to speak. And what we're finding is that corals that are found inside these ports are somewhat genetically distinct. Not to the point where they couldn't interbreed, but we're starting to see genetic signatures of adaptation, meaning that there are port corals or urban corals that seem to be a little bit different from those corals out on the reef. And we're hoping to discover whether or not those corals are actually contributing back to the reef population. So stay tuned on that. But secondly, we need to understand whether these corals are actually reproducing in real time. So just like the corals that Andrew's group brought back from Honduras, that they got to spawn in the lab, we want to know whether these corals in the port are doing this naturally. And if they are, can we harness that ability? So yes, I can spoil my own story here by saying that these corals are producing viable eggs and sperm. We have not, over the last 3 seasons, been able to actually see this coral spawning, but we know it's happening. They are very shy. They do not like a bunch of snorkelers watching them every night in the port. And so we've used a bunch of different technologies like cameras, as well as 12-hour rotations with our scientists being in some of the scariest parts of the marine ecosystems here in Miami, as well as bring corals back to the lab to see if we can induce them to spawn. And I'm really happy to say that this past spring, through its seemingly no action of our own, one of these corals that was collected from the port did spawn. And we caught it in time that with Andrew's group, we were able to crossbreed it with a coral that was collected from the reef. So for the first time that we've ever seen in the literature, we have actually now selectively crossbred an urban and a reef coral, and we have over 1,500 coral babies that were growing up, some of which have gone to restoration partners throughout the state to maintain that critical genetic biodiversity. But we're also gearing up to do experiments later this fall, so we can identify whether those resilient traits that the adults have might be conferred to the next generation, to see if we can selectively breed for resilient corals from these urban parental genotypes. So I'm very excited that we're at this critical stage right now, because it shows a major transition away from asexual reproduction, just breaking a coral into smaller pieces, into sexual reproduction, where we can increase the genetic diversity, hopefully out on the reef one day.
And can you parse yet apart like why they are resilient? Do they like the nutrients? Do they like the current? They can't like the turbidity. I mean, what is it that?
So they might like the turbidity.
Okay.
And we think it's a combination of a lot of different things. We say it's similar to sending a coral to the gym. They're toughening up because they're constantly experiencing this stress that's not bad enough to kill them, but it's enough to make them stronger. And so they seem to be able to tolerate these fluctuations in temperature by associating with different symbionts. They definitely like the food availability, and we found that they selectively feed on all of the particulates that come out of the Miami River and other freshwater sources in the area. And even the turbidity. we think could actually be a bit of a sunscreen for them, because these corals in some cases are sticking out of the water, and so they're receiving a lot of ultraviolet radiation that would normally make corals bleach. Yet these corals can recover remarkably fast in a couple weeks to a month, which is unheard of for a lot of corals. And so the turbidity might actually be a little bit of a protection for them, where when it's extremely hot during the summer, everything gets stirred up and it's dark for half the day on these urban sites inside the port, and maybe they're being shaded. So it's a combination of a lot of factors, it seems.
And are there multiple species, or is it just certain kinds that you would expect?
Exactly. It's a lot of different species. This is the remarkable thing, is coral diversity inside the port on seawalls is higher than it is out on the reef here. And a lot of that is because local stressors and some global stressors like marine heat waves leading to bleaching events, disease outbreaks, they have really caused reductions in the number of corals we have on the reef. But the majority of those species, with the exception of some of the branching corals, the acroporids, are found inside the port. And they grow enormous, as big as a coffee table, which if you are a Florida diver, you know that that's pretty rare to see a coral of that size.
And also in terms of time, normally we think of things evolving to situations happening over a very slow period of time, but we know how long these ports have been there.
Yes.
And how long coral possibly could have been, and how busy they've gotten. I mean, the ports today are not the ports of 50 years ago.
Not at all. So that's the advantage of the port is, or any urbanized port for that matter, is that we have records of everything. So we know when that seawall went in, or when those boulders were put alongside the highway. And so we can actually age every single coral, if you think about it, or at least get the maximum age that it could be. And what surprises me, not only is how big these corals have gotten in such a short amount of time, but how much they've proliferated. They are everywhere, hundreds and hundreds of corals. In fact, I believe the next slide, there we go. So this very grainy photo is actually just a still image taken from the Coral City camera. Do I have to click it one more time? Okay. So this will pull up a live stream. This is a really amazing resource in our backyard that none of us can see right now. But it is a live stream camera that was done in collaboration with our group as well as Coral Morphologic, which is a local coral husbandry and art collective based here in Miami. This is inside the Port of Miami right now. And so these are endangered staghorn corals that were outplanted along a shoreline that I can't tell you exactly where it is because it's a bit of a secret, because we see such amazing fish come through here. This area has become a hotspot for biodiversity, fish biodiversity, coral biodiversity, you name it. And so I welcome you to put this on when you're at work in the background. It's remarkable the number of different species that come through here and just how amazing it is that we have this kind of biodiversity sitting in our backyard in a really challenging environment.
So I want to clarify, because some people, the message may be a little mixed if people think like, oh, if coral can do this well in such terrible conditions, then why can't they deal with it on the reef? But they can't. And what is the distinction? If they can evolve in the port, why can't they evolve on the reef?
The short answer is we don't know yet. So it seems like the Port of Miami is this perfect storm of stress, that it's not too much that it ultimately kills them, but it's just enough. So I don't know is my answer to that.
And it's also not a reef.
Correct.
So they're not growing in the same formation?
Exactly. So out on the reef, these corals tend to be very slow growing, and they deposit calcium carbonate that forms the structure of the reef framework. The corals inside the port don't typically do that. They grow very quickly to get as big as possible. we think that that could be so that they don't get buried by sediments or so that they can just eat as much food as possible, but they don't deposit the same type of calcium carbonate. So it is not serving as a reef, but I like to think of it as a bit of an arc that is preserving genetic diversity and somehow also toughening up these corals.
And we should remind people, and maybe Andrew can speak to this, that the function of a reef is not just to grow coral.
Very true.
It's to provide storm protection, and which is
you can think of the corals as the trees in the rainforest that produce all the structure that all of those species depend on.
Okay. And so now I want to switch to Anna, because when we're talking about water conditions and what coral like, you have done some very interesting research to try and untangle that, to try and understand what exactly, how coral respond to nutrients like nitrogen, and why they might do better in some places as opposed to others. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jenny. I actually would like to start outside the coral topic. I think we have had a great time understanding all the interventions that we are working on to try to increase the resilience of the corals themselves. But I want to zoom out for a little bit and look at the Florida Reef. And in the map that we have behind, in red, you can see the extent of the reef and how linked we are to this ecosystem. This is 200 miles of a barrier reef that is protecting our homes from storm surge, are providing tourism, fisheries for our communities. So we are really linked to these ecosystems. And in red, we can see the reef, but about 70% of the reefs in this region are actually being degraded year by year because we have lost the live coral cover, and therefore the function, the actual services that the coral reef is providing is slowly going away as we cannot restore enough coral cover to protect that function. And the other reason why I want people to look at this picture and understand where the reefs are is because although they are a huge part of our coastal and marine ecosystems, they are indeed only a fraction. And there is a lot of other things that are happening around the reefs, and they could also play a huge role in resilience. Again, we have been talking a lot about how we make the corals stronger, but is there some other things that we can do in the environment to make reefs more likely to survive and hopefully at some point thrive in the next decades? So I don't know how your geography is, but I hope the pointer works. So we have the Everglades as our neighbor, the Florida Bay, which hosts extensive seagrass communities, and of course the city of Miami. We also have an impact in the reefs nearby. So here there is one example or a few examples of how these ecosystems are connected. As I said before, we have the Everglades, we have mangrove communities, and we have seagrass communities. And these ecosystems are connected not only through species, because a lot of the fish and other species migrate in between these ecosystems and different life stages, but the ecosystems are also connected through water. And as the water moves from one ecosystem to the other, the impact of a given ecosystem in that water, in the water quality, is going to be translated to the ecosystem downstream. And as the ecosystems are connected, so are the stressors that are threatening them. We are working to understand how a combination of stressors is actually having an impact on these coastal and marine ecosystems, because with climate change, nothing is happening in isolation. As the water increases its temperature, we are also seeing reduced pH or ocean acidification. We are seeing that the ocean has a lower capacity to keep oxygen, and we're seeing these hypoxic events that have happened in our bay. Some of those events are also linked to increased nutrient concentrations and water quality. So we have a huge variety of issues that at some point are reaching the reefs and changing the conditions that they're facing. We also, if you enjoy the beach, you have probably seen how crazy the sargassum has gotten and how difficult it is to make it to the water for a swim. You have to fight the algae. So at the end of the day, all these things are linked in a way that are part of a similar problem, but they could also be part of the solution. So we are taking a multidisciplinary approach to improve restoration and management. It's really important to grow stronger corals that could face climate change, but that is not the only solution, and we probably should be working on every possible path to try to restore and preserve our reef. So we're doing that combining a few different disciplines. We are using monitoring to assess what the conditions were in the past, what they are in the present, and we're also using modeling, different modeling models to understand what the temperature and nutrients and pH conditions are going to be in the future. And this is really important because when we restore, we need to restore for the present, but as well for the future, right? We have so many restoration efforts that, because they don't incorporate like the resilience that is needed for the future, may not succeed. We're also doing some actual coral work, trying to understand what are the responses of the corals to individual and combined stressors. And this is because sometimes when multiple things are happening, multiple bad things are happening to you at the same time, you're going to be less resistant to one of them. So if we have warming, and this is happening at the same time with increased acidification and lower pH or elevated nutrients or low oxygen concentrations, perhaps those corals are going to have a lower chance to survive than what we know they have when only one condition is affecting them. So this is important to be able to predict what's going to happen with this specific coral species in the future, and that helps managers to make choices, right? Like in what places of the reef we are seeing the fastest warming, so we know that if we're outplanting corals there, they have to be the most resistant to heat, but also what other species are more resilient to these stressors and could survive in those like hotspot locations. And finally, we want to be able to provide people with evaluating management scenarios. This includes anticipating if you outplant a certain amount of corals or are able to recover a certain amount of coral cover and improve these water conditions, is this gonna be enough to guarantee that the reef is gonna persist? And at the end of the day, we all depend on that, because the reef growing and the reef persistent through time is what's gonna preserve not only the beauty, but the jobs and the coastal protection associated to them. So in general, we're trying to have a community approach where we understand how the different players have a role on this. And not only that, but how other ecosystems and restoring other ecosystems is not only about restoring corals, may help coral restoration. And one example that we have is we have found that corals that are near seagrass beds are experiencing conditions that buffer ocean acidification. So ocean acidification threats the coral calcification or make corals grow more difficult. It's harder for them to calcify. So if we restore seagrass beds, perhaps we can help our coral restoration programs to have a higher chance of succeed. I just want to finish really quick showing some of the experimental capacities that we have here at the University of Miami in the experimental reef lab. We have a wet lab that we pretty much took apart destroyed and rebuilt completely because we wanted to be able to understand those impacts of the multiple stressors. And this is something that is not easy to do as a scientist. When you run an experiment, you are testing one stressors, and that's hard enough sometimes. But when you want to test 2, 3 things and how they interact, you really need the tools. And sometimes finding those commercially is not easy. So we have 16 tanks that have been redesigned and reconditioned with technology that we have created in-house in order to be able to run this experiment. And I hope the lab is open for anyone that wants to come and visit, either like after this conversation or at any other point. We're also pioneering the implementation of new technology to help restoration. So we can see here, this is one of our robot arms, and with this kind of work, we're testing if, like, both what is the impact of the multi-stressors on the corals, on the coral growth and survivorship, but also what are the impacts of some of the solutions. If we improve the water chemistry and increase pH, can we make baby corals that grow a lot faster and could speed up restoration and really help increase the magnitude of how we can outplant corals back in the reef? So yeah, there are very challenging news for us, but I feel there is a lot of creativity and committed people to find solutions.
And I would just want to emphasize that creativity and building part, because I'm always amazed whenever I wander into a lab and see something and realize that you guys know how to use a table saw. Like you built it yourself. I mean, and it cannot be understated. I think that a scientist who's trained in a lab also is like a carpenter. I mean, it is and an engineer, and the things that they do to MacGyver equipment and come up with a solution because you're the first one trying to do it. You actually have to figure out the equipment and how to do it, and it's kind of amazing.
Absolutely. I feel like people in our lab have learned about electronics, and like it's incredible.
Well, and sorry, just one. Sometimes you have to figure those things out, especially with coral, in the middle of the night on the fly, surrounded by mosquitoes. I mean, it's not easy work. The other thing that you brought up that I just want to mention, or want you to talk a little bit more about, is the idea that like a reef does well next to a seagrass meadow. That placement, logically, it makes sense. These things evolve together. But until now, until I saw your paper, I didn't really realize that the interaction. It goes beyond just water flow, like how are coral doing next to a river, but things like seagrass, you know, is like I think I said to Michael, like, the port, it's like growing next to a highway, but you'd way prefer to grow next to a seagrass meadow, right, if you were a coral.
Yeah, it was a little bit of a surprising finding in a way, because these corals that are in closer proximity to seagrass beds are also our inshore reefs, which are also closer to nutrient runoff and like other stressors. But some of the most beautiful reefs that persist in Florida are actual inshore reefs, and we have one site that is part of our monitoring program. Is called Chica Rocks, and this reef has been able to maintain high coral cover and survive a lot of the impacts of warming. So what we have found is there is actually a huge amount of water that is flowing from Florida Bay into these reefs. And as the water passes through the seagrass beds, there is carbon capture. So there are these pulses in which the reef is experiencing higher pH values because of what the seagrass is doing to the water and how it's mitigating the impacts of ocean acidification. So we need to understand what's the role of other ecosystems and how restoring the function of those ecosystems actually could help us restore reefs and offer the corals better conditions to survive. Another thing I want to mention is we have another ambition restoration project, which is the Everglades Comprehensive Restoration Plan. I don't know if I said it in the right order, but you get the idea. And this is going to change how water management is happening in South Florida. We need to understand if that's going to impact the reefs and if it's going to be in a good, in a positive or in a negative way. So looking at this from the big picture really help us to facilitate managers the right comprehensive information that they need to make decisions.
And while this goes back to the, I guess, the chemistry, you can figure out what coral need to do better and the water conditions, and you could breed coral for that, but the trickier part of the equation is controlling the water conditions. Right. So is there a way around that that doesn't involve massive management that is often very hard to implement? Not that it shouldn't be, but...
Right, so we can do, as you said, that in the lab for short periods of time, and that could still be super relevant as we talk about restoration. And Andrew says like we need hundreds of thousands of corals to get out of to the reef. We can inland manipulate those conditions to speed up the growth of the baby corals, which is kind of the bottleneck of restoration sometimes. We're trying to grow the babies, and they're the most vulnerable at that time. But yes, you are right. When you are in the reef, like how do you control water quality in such a mass scale? And I think that has to be a combination of like management, but also understanding when and how the water is moving through different places. Not all the time the water is flowing in the same way, so you can also look at what are the seasonal patterns in which, like, what is the right time for the water from this place to come to this place? And yeah, can I improve some of those nearby ecosystems to improve water quality? I think the city of Miami has done a great job as well with like controlling fertilizers during the rainy season, and that it's definitely having a great impact on reducing like nutrient levels and nutrient getting into the water and causing hypoxic events. But yeah, it does require some work to translate that to the reef scale, as it requires a lot of work to figure out how to improve climate change.
Okay. So I'm going to leave time for questions. One more thing, though, that I want to cover that recently was in the news a lot was artificial reefs. So last week we heard about the Reef Line underwater sculpture project. But it is I mean, I grew up in Florida, artificial reefs. We don't have a great track record with artificial reefs in Florida. I grew up in Fort Lauderdale, where there are still 500,000 tires off the beach and a very probably worst case scenario of an artificial reef. But there is new research into how to make an artificial reef that actually can provide storm coverage and coral restoration. And Andrew, can you talk a little bit about what that takes? That it doesn't, I found out today that there's like 2 tanks that were sunk as an artificial reef off Miami Beach in the 90s. I didn't know that. Maybe divers out there know that. But anyway, we don't want to be sinking tanks, right?
Sure. So you're right, artificial reefs have been in the news recently and are undergoing somewhat of a resurgence, you might say. But it's really a specific kind or approach to artificial reefs. So in the past, Florida sunk a lot of artificial structures, shall we say, generally in deep water, as a fish aggregation attraction. So a diving attraction or a fish aggregation device that would enhance fisheries, commercial or recreational. The new type of artificial reef that I think people may be hearing about are maybe more accurately called a hybrid reef. And it's a reef that is placed in much shallower water, typically 10 to 15 feet, with the structure then approaching fairly close to the surface, And the goal of that structure is very specifically to break waves, to attenuate wave energy, protect coastlines. And the reason it's hybrid is it's a combination of an artificial structure, usually made out of concrete, could be 3D printed, could be cast, with active restoration of resilient corals that can do well enough in those really tough nearshore environments to actually build the structure and make it self-repairing and self-growing, so that as sea levels continue to rise, this structure can keep pace with it. So yeah, you do hear a lot of interest in this because there's a lot of interest in protecting coastlines. It turns out that Miami-Dade and Fort Lauderdale are hotspots worldwide for the value of coral reefs in protecting coastlines because we're so low-lying and we have built so much infrastructure coast to shore. So Miami-Dade County, for example, the reefs that we have protect our coast to the amount of about $400 million a year in avoided damages and economic losses. And we sort of take that for granted because they're out there sort of doing their thing out of sight and out of mind. But if you can put in hybrid reefs, slightly closer to shore in specific areas, you could recoup, by one estimate that was just published recently, another $355 million a year in avoided damages. So that gets people's interest, especially when we start to see and hear about more and more coastal flooding. And Florida needs this, right? The coastal resilience challenge in Florida is a big tent. We need everybody inside it, and we need everybody to be sort of working towards the same goals. But it is a really challenging process in how you design these structures, how you create corals that are going to be thermally tolerant and able to deal with these conditions. And I think we just have to be careful when you hear the news headlines to realize that if we're going to do this right, we really need to use the best scientific approaches and engineering approaches to do this in the most effective way possible. And that does take time. It takes research, it takes careful study of the site that you're going to work at. And we've been doing that at the University of Miami. We have our hybrid reef off of Miami Beach at around 80th Street, where we're funded by the Department of Defense to design a next generation hybrid reef that combines new engineering approaches and new designs to attenuate wave energy with these resilient corals that we talked about earlier that can do well in these environments. So we welcome, as many people as we can into the space, but it has to be very science-driven and engineering-focused, I think, because that's the way that we're going to recoup the most benefits from it.
And I have like a lot more questions about how it's done. I feel like it'd be highly complicated to figure out the topography, the underwater topography, where you put these things, how high, where, how wide, all this stuff. But I don't want to take up that time now, so we'll just go to questions because I tend to ramble on. So do you want to give?
Can I get McKenna and Sarah? Come on down, ladies. We're going to run around the auditorium here. If you have a question, just raise your hand. And, oh, wow. Okay, so one question a person, and that way everybody gets a chance to ask a question. That would be great. So when you have asked your question, give the mic back to the young ladies. Thank you.
This might be slightly off topic, but you showed the map of South Florida, and you showed in red the reef growing, but there was no reef in the Gulf of America. It was all on the Atlantic Ocean side. Is that true? There's no reef?
Well, first, what I show in red is the reef. Not all of that is growing, and that is very challenging because 70% of that in red is actually eroding and going away. But no, there are reefs and very beautiful reefs in the Gulf. We have one site that is called the Flower Garden Banks, and this reef has been able to persist through time with a high coral cover. in part because of a combination of environmental factors, is a relatively deep reef, so it is not exposed to such a high temperatures as the ones that we experience in the surface water that is like warming up faster.
And it's off Texas, right?
It's off of the Gulf of, yeah, exactly. So when we go and visit and monitor these places, we go to Galveston and then we take a research cruise to monitor this reef. So yeah, it's one of the most beautiful reefs in the continental US, and we try to get there every couple of years to monitor their condition.
And it's the distinction too, maybe I'm wrong, but ours is a barrier reef, right? I mean, whenever I see like Florida's only inshore barrier reef and the reefs further up in the Gulf.
It's definitely smaller in its magnitude. So yeah, it's a different type of reef.
Hi. Yeah, you talked about some of the cost of building artificial reefs, but can you talk about what the cost is to restore the reefs, and what are some potential some of the funding sources that could come to do this project, and how do you show an economic return on restoring the reef?
Thanks, yeah, great question. So, funnily enough, I don't think I did mention the cost of putting in a reef, and it's topical because I was just in a meeting today where we were putting together a budget to do that off of Miami Beach at scale. So, you know, it's, you know, the cost of putting in the artificial structure is one cost, and then the cost of putting in the corals on top is another cost. You combine those two costs, and most estimates agree that the benefit that you get from adopting that hybrid approach that involves both the sort of gray cement-based and the green nature-based approach is cheaper than a conventional gray infrastructure, but you're building seawalls or building groins offshore to protect, because you get these, you reap these additional biological benefits. The problem, which I think your question anticipated, is I just said that earlier on that coral reefs in Miami-Dade, urban Miami-Dade, offer us $400 million in avoided coastal damages and economic losses. That doesn't mean to say, unfortunately, that the corals are sending us a check every year for $400 million. So the question really is, how do you capitalize that avoided loss into something that you can then use to restore reefs or put out hybrid reefs? And that's where the economists come in, because there are ways in which you can do that, working with the insurance and the reinsurance industries to try to use that to adopt some of these approaches. I think the really interesting finding was the paper that was published in January that looked at the benefits of putting out hybrid reefs, also looked at the cost of doing that, and they concluded that in some areas in Florida, South Florida, Southeast Florida, the cost of installing a hybrid reef would be recouped by in terms of avoided damages within a year. So they're incredibly cost-effective investments, and the question is really, how do we generate enough enthusiasm locally to put those reefs in so that local populations can receive those benefits? And we're working with local municipalities, City of Miami Beach, the Village of Key Biscayne, Town of Hollywood. They're all interested in these approaches and all interested in trying this new approach at a sort of demonstration scale, so about 100 meters long or so to begin with.
You know, it seems there's a really big difference between incoming and outgoing tides as far as the amount of pollution. And I would imagine that affects the coral a lot. But what I was really wondering is, isn't there places on Earth where the temperature is warmer than Florida that has coral? And as the corals spawn, wouldn't it migrate to cooler waters?
Yes and no. It depends on where we're talking. So as Anna said, water doesn't move in the same way all the time, and it changes quite a bit. So if we think off the coast of Florida, we have the Gulf Stream current, which moves roughly northward and up to Bermuda. That's how we have that high latitude reef system. And so it's theoretically possible that some of the larvae or gametes that are released from these warmer water adapted corals might be making it to those areas that that are generally cooler. We don't entirely know. It takes a lot of different types of hydrodynamic modeling to release simulated coral eggs and sperm and see where they go. But fortunately, we have this built-in time machine, which is looking at the coral's genes. So by using approaches like population genetics, we actually are looking at integration over multiple generations, and so we can understand whether anything like that is happening. So it's really hard to say, and we haven't, for the most part, done work to kind of look at the downstream populations from some of these more thermally tolerant locations.
There's another side to the question, though, like in Honduras, which is warmer than Florida, as I mentioned, but it's about 1,000 miles distant from us here in Miami. So one might question, well, wouldn't normally these corals produce propagules or babies or offspring that would make it to the Florida Keys? And indeed they do. We know from genetic evidence that a few individuals per generation make it from the southern end of the Mesoamerican Barrier Reef, which is Honduras, to the Florida Keys. But the problem is that's just a vanishingly small number of corals. And if we depend on that kind of natural replenishment to make up for the losses that we're inflicting on these populations, it's just not going to be enough. And so that's really where the word assisted gene flow comes in. We're trying to assist it by many orders of magnitude to get more heat-tolerant genes into the local population much faster than natural process could operate. And that's really just goes back to the problem of climate change, which is that people will often mention, well, hasn't the world been warmer than it is right now? And indeed it has, but it's not warmed up as fast. The rate of change is just outpacing any natural adaptive mechanism to cope. And so that requires, unusual measures on our part to try to accelerate the pace of change, adaptive change.
I guess I'm next. Give me the microphone. I have a question about Port Everglades. Apparently they're going to dredge to make it deeper, and apparently there's a big coral reef right in the path of the dredging. So I have really two questions. One, are they working with you to try to ameliorate damages? And secondly, can the whole reef just be picked up and transported and relocated to a different location to save it? It seems a pity to just bury it.
I'll answer your second question first. And the short answer is no. We cannot just put it on a trailer and move it up, or on a boat or a barge, unfortunately, because that framework is literally built into the bedrock that is the coastline of Florida. But to answer your first question, yes. There are many groups that are involved in coral relocation. I'd say that one of the advantages of the Port Everglades expansion project is that we've learned from what not to do down here in Miami, because the Port Miami expansion that happened about 10, 15 years ago went a very different way, and we suffered losses of hundreds of thousands of coral colonies. And so learning from those mistakes, there's direct buy-in by researchers during the dredging operations, even in advance of the dredging operations. In fact, Andrew's group is housing some of the corals that were removed in advance of construction from Port Everglades and brought down to here. So this time around, we're learning from that and preserving that genetic diversity before any damage can occur.
And I will say I did a story last week on that, and I wasn't able to get a response from the Army Corps because of the government shutdown, but I know Miami Waterkeeper has been pressing them, had a lawsuit, and had been in negotiations. They said in January, suddenly things sped up very quickly, so there's an environmental impact statement that is open for public comment now. There's a link in my story if you want to weigh in on that and submit a comment, how to do that. Or you can you may be able to find it in the Federal Register, although to me that's hard to do. So maybe just go to our website.
Hi, I have a question about the hybrid elkhorn corals. So after they're brought to your lab, Dr. Baker, and you're ready to bring them out into the open ocean, I know that elkhorn corals, they're very platy and they take up a lot of space. Is there not a risk of them outcompeting like the current species here in the Florida reefs and possibly bringing, I'd say, like reasonably healthy species to extinction? And then is there a strategy for how you guys outplant them?
Absolutely. I'm so glad you asked this question. Just a quick distinction. They're not technically hybrids. There is a hybrid acropora out there, which is actually a hybrid of two species, cervicornis, staghorn, and elkhorn. So these are not hybrid acropora in that sense. They're crosses of different populations of elkhorn coral. So slight distinction. So yeah, because this is the first time this has ever happened, that a government has sanctioned, in this case the state of Florida, has sanctioned the outplanting of internationally crossed corals from a related population to be outplanted in the wild, we had to be exceptionally careful in terms of how we proposed what we were doing. One of the things we did to minimize the risk or the perception of risk, because actually the risk is very low, but that there might be outbreeding depression. In other words, if you try to outcross populations from different areas, it could be that they're genetically incompatible in some way. And so there's a risk of that. So we're monitoring that very carefully. And then as far as your question about how do you avoid vectoring in or introducing species that might be parasitic or pathogenic, the approach that we've used is to not bring the corals in, from Honduras on a jet and plunk them down onto the reef, which would bring with them all kinds of other organisms, but to put them into closed systems here at the university that we call spawning tanks, where all the corals from Honduras are in this one tank. They're not sharing water with anything from Florida. And when they spawn, we essentially use IVF techniques, just the same way as in humans. In vitro fertilization, the eggs and the sperm are collected. We do it in petri dishes. Everything is almost sort of sterile in that sense. And so when the baby coral grows up, it's free from all those external possible influences that could have come in with the coral. But it's something that we're definitely still monitoring. Because we're doing this for the first time, we absolutely want to cross all our I's, dot all our I's and cross all our T's to make sure that we're doing this using the best possible practices. And something else that you didn't ask, but I'll just throw out there, is that we obviously have to be really careful to be sensitive internationally, right? If we're going to work with international partners, there has to be something in it for the Honduran, in this case, partners that we're working with. So we're very much trying to introduce the same technological approaches and help the folks in Tela, Honduras, as they also trying to protect their reefs, so that we can help them save their reefs, work internationally with the Honduran government to make sure they understand the possible benefits of this, and extend that model around the Caribbean so that we're not perceived as this is all about Florida and saving Florida's corals. It's not. It's actually about trying to save the region's species. It just happens that we're starting in Florida because that's where the technology currently is.
Can urban corals survive on the reef, and have you tried a transplant?
We have tried to transplant them. In fact, one of the graduate students, now a PhD here at Rosenstiel, did exactly that. And I would say it's a little complicated because at the time when we did this experiment, it was the summer of 2023. And so if you remember that, it was quite hot. And so we lost some corals to bleaching. So it was a bit hard to disentangle whether that was because they came from the Port of Miami or because it was just quite hot. And then conversely, we're trying to evaluate whether you could take corals from the reef and put them inside the Port of Miami for a year and see if they can acclimatize to those stressful conditions and then be stronger when you put them back out on the reef. And I wish I had better news, but we lost most of those corals because they were smothered by a literal blanket. So there are some unique challenges to using the Port of Miami both as a source of corals but also as a training site to strengthen corals for restoration outcomes. I'd say the story is not over on that. I think it needs more experimentation, more research into that, and that's something that we are doing right now with restoration partners to see whether we can scale up the incorporation of urban corals from the Port of Miami into land-based coral propagation operations as well as coral outplanting operations throughout Southeast Florida.
I will add to that a fun fact, which is the Port of Miami corals are very yummy and they seem to be delicious. So when you put them in the reef, fish just go crazy and predate on them. So when you outplant some of those Port of Miami corals in the reef, you should probably think about some kind of like temporary protection so they grow enough to survive all the fish that are gonna be just going and predating them then.
They do. They selectively eat the urban corals and they will leave the reef corals alone. We think it has to do with the fact that the urban corals are constantly eating different food sources. So they don't just rely on photosynthesis. And so perhaps that makes them tastier compared to the reef corals. And I really hope we can figure that problem out.
So we have time for about 2 more questions. Let me see a show of hands. Who wants to ask a question? Wow. Okay, so we have 3 more people here. Let's this gentleman here, the lady next to him, and then we're going to wrap it up. But if you, and I'm sorry, I keep seeing you raise your hand. 3 last questions here. If you want to ask more questions to the scientists, they're on the websites. Feel free to email them, or you can send them to me. I'm on the website. I'll happily pass them along.
Anna
and the tour.
Yes,
And the
Anna
tour.
and I are more than happy to show anyone who's interested the experimental reef lab in one
Tonight.
of the adjacent buildings. Tonight.
Exactly.
There will be robots.
It's a Halloween theme.
They're willing to take you, so those of you, just stick around and you can go for a tour over at the Experimental Reef Lab. Okay, question, where were we? Over here, this lady.
So I'm going to follow up on the fish. I was just learning about the reef in Madagascar and how the overfishing has kind of changed the ecosystem such that the algal blooms are killing the coral reef. What is the state of the fishing industry? Are they partners? Is this something or is there a fishing component to the loss of coral reef?
So it's a bit of a different problem here in Florida where we typically don't eat fish that like to eat coral. This is primarily parrotfish. Elsewhere in the world, they eat a lot of parrotfish. And oftentimes that's because all the other bigger and more palatable fish have been overfished. And so we almost don't have that problem at all because we have massive parrotfish populations, which are actually contributing to declines in corals just from their grazing, but also contributing to mortality when we try to outplant corals. So it's a bit of a unique problem. I don't think we're going to convince anyone to eat parrotfish here because something that eats rocks for a living probably doesn't taste all that good.
People have been really receptive eating lionfish, which is apparently really tasty, and it's an invasive species that actually eats a lot of the larvae of other fish, so it's threatening the populations of other reef fishes for sure. I will add to that of course the reefs are the nurseries for a lot of commercial species, and it's in the best interest of the fishermen and the fishing industry to work with scientists and managers to preserve the reefs. Most of the benefits for the juveniles and the baby fish are based on the reef structure. So even sometimes if we don't have a huge coral cover, the reef is still finding home, the fish is still finding a home in the reef. But as the structure disappears and the complexity of the reef it's lower, then it's going to be harder and harder for the fish to kind of hide and make that their nurseries. And that's one of the key importance of this high complex species as the acroporas that now we almost don't have in the Florida Reef. Those create this bushy, really intricate architecture that is where a lot of those juveniles hide and are protected.
And I'll just add too, fishing regulations and setting up marine preserves, as you can probably imagine, is pretty contentious in Florida. The Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary just spent years trying to put together a plan that didn't quite make it through, and they're still trying to wrestle with that. If you want to look closely at that, you can probably find out more about the impacts.
And I'll just add, just to bring your story full circle, is I did some research in Madagascar 25 years ago almost. And in areas of the world where people really depend on local fish for most of their animal protein, where the reef is literally the grocery store, which in Madagascar back in 2001 when I was there, it definitely is. You know, that's where you really see this pressure of the local human population on extracting as much edible protein from the reef as possible. And that's where you really see these human-fish conflicts occurring, where it becomes a matter of sort of traditional livelihoods versus marine conservation. Who wins that argument is a tricky one, and lots of NGOs have worked in Madagascar and East Africa trying to resolve those the exact conflicts.
Okay.
Okay.
Raise a hand. So who wants to go on the tour for the? One more question. I'm sorry. Okay, last one for the night.
2 more questions.
Two more questions. Okay.
I just wanted to add on to a prior question. Are there efforts currently in the U.S. to explant non-crossbred heat-resilient corals from the Indo-Pacific and Red Sea? And what concerns do we have to consider before trying?
So, great question, and yeah, so this is now going, even more into the realm of how far do we go to try to restore ecosystems, and the short answer to your question is there are not efforts necessarily per se in trying to do that right now, introducing species from a totally different region to try to restore reefs in some way, but there is mounting scientific interest in that question, and that question would have been verging on the absurd even 5 years ago. I don't think many reputable coral reef scientists would really want to be associated with that, but it's amazing how much times have changed, and that idea which is called ecological replacement in the literature. That's the idea of if we lose Florida's acropora, and if we were to lose them all around the Caribbean, would we consider bringing in acropora from the Indo-Pacific? And obviously those kinds of things have happened on land regularly. Is the marine realm different? Under what circumstances would we ever consider that? And we're actually, mark your calendars, hoping to have a workshop discussing the ethical, legal, and regulatory consequences of ecological replacement on coral reefs right here at Erasmus on December the 15th. So it's definitely a question that is being posed as an interesting exercise. That doesn't mean to say it's actually happening, but I think people are interested in knowing what does the scientific community think of that before we're suddenly faced with having to make a decision about it without having any prep time.
I would like to add that there are some warning signs from natural occurrences. For example, there is an invasive soft coral that's native to the Mediterranean that has somehow made its way into parts of the Caribbean as well as into the Pacific. And it's become so prevalent in areas such as in Pearl Harbor that the only solution is to cover the entire reef with a tarp until everything dies and then bury it in cement. And so that is a very drastic response, but it has been the only thing so far that's been successful. And so I'd say that as these discussions continue, extreme caution needs to be exercised in order to avoid hitchhikers or unintended species transfers if this is to move forward.
I just wanted to make a comment really quick before my question. I work for Miami Waterkeeper, and there is a petition on their website to try to stop the Port Everglades dredging. So I would recommend checking that out and maybe sharing it. My question, at the Carnegie Science Institution, they're currently doing research with non-pathogenic viral gene insertion into pre-spawning corals to make more resilient corals on more of a genetic level. Is that any work that you guys would consider doing in your labs in the near future?
So new gene editing technologies like this and CRISPR-Cas9, which probably you've heard of as well, are also entering the conversation now for the first time in terms of how far do we go to engineer corals that are going to be more thermally tolerant, let's say. The stuff that I talked about are, you know, steps towards trying to reach that without going so far. And I think we have to be careful to make sure we exhaust all possible alternatives before we actually move to those approaches. But just like the ecological replacement question, this is also coming up. And folks at Carnegie, Phil Cleaves is the scientist there, doing cutting edge work on this, having some success in being able to show that they can turn on, turn off genes through these kinds of approaches. And that is the world that we live in. That is the world that our children are going to inherit, where gene editing and genetically modified organisms, which are already here, will be applied across many ecosystems in many areas, including conservation. So I don't think it's so much a question of whether or not that will or will not happen. It's really a question of when and how. And that's really the cutting edge of marine conservation in the 21st century, I think, or conservation in general.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenny. Thank you, Dr. Baker, Dr. Studevan, Dr. Palacio. If you want to take a tour, can we just see a show of hands? Oh my goodness. Okay. All right. Just meet Anna and Michael right outside the door. I just want to remind you, November 12th is our next Climate Cafe, where we will be looking at the hidden engineers of the deep and how fish shape the ocean's carbon cycle. So please join us on November 12th, and empanadas will be hot. They'll be here. Okay. Thank you.